Hello and welcome to New England Authors. Every episode we try to explore a different subject. And the subject today is going to be presented by Andrew Ross. Andrew, wonderful of you to come here, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. You're not only a professor, you're an activist. Would you call yourself that?
Yes.
An activist in labor rights. You study sweatshops and so on, right?
That's part of my activism, yes. I also do cultural activism.
Cultural activism? In what way?
In the art world, in museums.
Really?
And I've also been involved in the debt movement, the debt resistance movement, for the abolition of student debt and household debt.
Oh.
Yeah.
But your latest book is something that's very different. It's called Stone Men, and it takes place in Palestine, and it's about the building of Palestinian settlements, Israeli settlements in the West Bank mostly. Is that what it's about?
A lot about Israel too, the state of Israel.
Yeah. Why don't you start by filling in on the history you did your research there in 2015 to 2018, right?
Yeah, the last few years, yes.
And why don't you fill us in a little bit on the history of the Palestinians and the stone work that they do? If you go to that area, it's very beautiful. The houses are made of stone. They're really nice, big, airy houses. Where did that start?
Well, it's the West Bank of Palestine is home to some of the best dolomitic limestone in the world. So underneath the Central Highlands are these vast stone reserves, and so when you see the stone there, it's local, it's organic, it's authentic. And Palestinian stonemasons themselves are a venerable craft. For hundreds of years they've been sought out because of their superior skills, and the stone is really very, very good indeed. So it's a big stone industry.
It's a white stone, right?
It's mostly white. There are different hues and colors and textures, which mean a lot in the industry. But it's mostly marketed as Jerusalem stone. That's the worldwide, the recognized brand.
Is it exported as well, or?
It is exported. Palestinian stone producers are a small population, but they are the 10th largest stone producer in the world.
Amazing.
And some part of the product is exported. It's very difficult to export because of Israeli authority constraints on the industry. But most of the stone, 75% of it, that is quarried actually goes to Israel and the settlements. So the cruel paradox is that the very contents of the Palestinian land are being used to build out the state of Israel and the spreading archipelago of settlements in the West Bank.
Yeah, so the stone of Palestinians is like the marble of Italians.
It is. I mean, the Italians are the forerunner in the industry globally, but because there are two natural resources in the West Bank that are in short supply in Israel: water and stone. And the water, a lot of the water is siphoned off by Israelis and settlers. The stone is still very much under Palestinian ownership and control, but because it's the largest private sector employer in the West Bank, the industry, there's a heavy dependence on it, and so it's often referred to as white oil in Palestine.
White oil, yeah. So what's the history of the settlements? You've studied Israel a lot. Give us the history of the settlements in the West Bank.
Well, the settlements in the West Bank post-date 1967, the beginning of the occupation, and every day they spread, more and more of them, and if Prime Minister Netanyahu has his way, they will be fully annexed to the state of Israel in the years to come, maybe even in the very near future. I think when people, in the public mind, when people think about the settlements in the West Bank, they think that they're heavily guarded and fortified to keep Palestinians out. But in fact, on any given day, you can find Palestinians there working, building houses, building infrastructure, maintaining the settlements themselves. The workforce basically is Palestinian in the settlements, as it is for the most part in Israel itself.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that's widely known, but also I think a lot of Israelis are in denial about it.
Yeah.
The degree to which Palestinians have built their country. And in my book, I really try to review the history of employment in the construction industry and find that for more than a century, basically, Palestinian laborers have been the preferred workforce in the industry. So they have quite literally built Israel.
Yes, and by doing so, they've lost their land. The settlements take over their land.
They have. This is the tragic story, and the more that Palestinians move off the land in agriculture and into waged labor in construction, the easier it is for the settlers to take over the land, because the attachment to the land decreases.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is one of the ironies of working for the occupier. It makes it easier for the occupier to take your land.
Yeah. It's also, they've taken a lot of olive trees, and they've made Palestinians into kind of a forced labor market. Would you say that's true?
I might take issue with the term forced labor, because I'm very particular about the use of that.
Okay.
That does imply a level of physical coercion, which is not there. I mean, it has been historically after the Nakba, after 1948. Palestinians inside Israel were forced to labor in labor camps, but since then, the term I prefer is compulsory labor.
Okay.
Which is to say that there are very few alternatives that pay a living wage, and that is by design. Israeli policy has underdeveloped Palestinian economy, has stifled development of Palestinian economy by design, and so there really aren't any alternative livelihoods that pay more than a starvation wage, really. And that is why I did a lot of interviews at the checkpoints crossing the Green Line into Israel. You find college-educated men standing in line who are working in the construction industry. They can't find employment in the West Bank that pays a living wage, either as teachers or engineers or what have you.
Mm. So these settlements are Jewish only. For residents, Palestinian couldn't buy anything in that area.
No.
There are also roads that are Jewish only. Is that right?
There are roads that are only for settlers, and there's quite an extensive infrastructure that has been built in the West Bank to service the settlers, and it expands every day. And becomes part of what is called Greater Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the metropolitan area of Jerusalem extends now far into the West Bank.
Right. Yeah. So what's going to happen? These settlements are expanding. What's going to happen to the Palestinians?
Well, I'm not in the business of prediction. It seems that the fast-moving debate, however, is about now the single state solution.
Yes.
I think Netanyahu's relationship with Donald Trump has meant that the so-called two-state solution is now really consigned to the trash can of history, and it was kept alive for political convenience by the political class in Israel and the U.S. and also in Ramallah in the West Bank. But now what we have is a prospect of a single state, a unitary, secular, democratic state with full civil and political rights for Palestinians. That's the ideal prospect. More likely prospect is that we will see more of the same. Creeping annexation of land, and ultimately, if you if you believe that the maximalist Zionists will have their way, then all of the land from the river to the sea will be declared to be Israeli land.
So you were there. What's the situation between individual Palestinians and Israelis there in the West Bank? Is it confrontational? What happens?
It certainly can be, and it's not difficult to to find clashes every Friday afternoon in certain places. But there's also a working relationship, quite literally, of employer to employee, which you find everywhere in the settlements and in Israel. And over the decades, Israeli authorities have tried to find replacement workforces. Mizrahi Jews were brought in after 1948. Migrant workers from overseas were brought in after the first Intifada to replace Palestinians. But they've only really been partially successful as replacements. And today, the number of West Bank Palestinians who are working in Israel and the settlements is higher than ever before.
Interesting.
So they remain the preferred workforce, and the relationship between employer and employee, of course, is very fraught. But it's a form of coexistence which has been there really for more than 100 years.
Mm-hmm. So this is New England Authors. We're recording here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and broadcasting on stations around the region. Thanks to the Curiosity Foundation for their support. And we're talking with Andrew Ross, written a very interesting book about Palestine, Israel, called Stone Men. Their workforce, their building hurts as a community, right? Because they're building these places for Israelis. Is there tension among other Palestinians that they shouldn't be doing this work?
Well, psychologically, yes, but there are no alternatives. Palestinian Authority, for example, insists that it's illegal for Palestinians to work in the settlements. But because they can't offer an alternative, they can't enforce that. And the fact of the matter is that you can get paid twice as much working for an Israeli employee than you can working for a West Bank employer. So really it's a matter of simple economics and putting food on the table for your family. That's what it boils down to. However, there's a very complicated political doctrine. It's quite easy. It boils down to something quite easy. It's called jobs for peace. You will be issued with a work permit to earn this better wage if you eschew any dissident activity. If anyone in your family steps out of line, you lose your work permit.
I see.
And so this is a form of, it's a policy which could be called economic pacification. To ensure that there's no resistance if you want to keep your job. So.
Yeah. So, and the job for one person would be to support the whole family, often.
Well, Palestinian families tend to be fairly large, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. So there may be, several folks who are working. Sons in the family, sometimes the fathers also, who are crossing the Green Line and working for the occupier. That's not untypical, or in the settlements. The reason why they're preferred is kind of interesting, because from the Israeli perspective, why would you want to be employing your enemy?
Yeah.
Often seen.
Yes.
And for a long time, the answer to that question has been, well, Palestinians are cheaper. They're also better workers. They're more skilled. They have centuries of construction experience in the region. But there are other reasons too, which are interesting and that most people don't know about. One is that their wages, unlike the migrant workers from overseas who also work in the industry, they send their wages to their home country.
Exactly.
In remittances. Palestinians take their wages to the West Bank, and they buy Israeli goods at Israeli prices, which is economically very beneficial for the Israeli economy.
Yes.
In addition, they go home every night most of them, at least the ones with the permits, and so they don't impose any burden on the state, on the Israeli state. There are no social costs, whereas the foreign migrant workers are there, and for many, I guess, right-wing Israeli Jews, they are a demographic threat to the Jewish character of the nation. Palestinians pose no such threat. So they are, they're kind of ideal workers. One of my interviewees described them as human gold.
One of your Jewish Palestinians.
Yeah, Palestinian. We are human gold, he said. And the occupation is, I guess, the goose that lays a golden egg.
So the problem is that they're not allowed to build. Very few work permits are issued by the Israeli governments for Palestinians. Isn't that right?
Well, relatively, increasingly there are more and more. In fact, right-wing Israelis are politicians are more in favor of increasing the number of permits because they see it as very good for business, and it's also good public relations for Israel to be perceived to be, offering employment to Palestinians at relatively decent wages, or at least wages that are better than West Bank wages.
So, could I ask you a personal question? What got you interested in the West Bank? What got you interested in Israel, Palestine? Did you go there as a kid or something?
I worked in a kibbutz 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
A few months. And it was a kibbutz on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And I ran across a couple of Palestinian day laborers in one of my work shifts there. And I never got to ask them the questions I wanted to ask them because I was curious about them. And really didn't return to the region until 35 years later when a Palestinian friend asked me to come and help him make a film there. And he wanted me as a labor analyst to come and interview workers for the film. And that's when I realized there was a story here that I wanted to tell about the workers and the worker conditions, and also about the stone industry, because there isn't a single published study of the stone industry in Palestine.
That's right. Yeah, I think you're the first. I've read a lot of literature, and I think you're the first person that I've talked to about this, which is very interesting. There's also a picture in your book of you 40 years ago on the kibbutz. Did you have a good time there when you were there?
Yes, I did. I was a hippie in these days, and working in a kibbutz was it was kind of international circuit of traveler. You put in a little bit of time in a kibbutz, and then you moved on, as I moved on to Egypt during that tour.
And you've traveled to many countries and studied their labor practices and their situations.
Yes, I was coming actually before Palestine. I was coming off a few years of doing work in Abu Dhabi on conditions of migrant workers in Abu Dhabi, and I got barred from entry to the UAE for my labors there, and in a sense, when I went to Palestine after that, I realized, well, here I am talking to migrant workers in their own land. A kind of related proposition to the migrant workers in the Gulf states, but really quite different because they're laboring on their own ancestral lands and traveling to work through checkpoints, which really have the power and the authority of international checkpoints in a way.
Yeah. So, can you describe the checkpoints? What are they like?
They're horrible. They really are horrible. There's no other word for them. They're designed to humiliate. Workers will line up sometimes at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark for a few hours, and the rate at which they are admitted through the checkpoint is entirely at the whim of the soldier who is manning the checkpoint. And if he's in a good mood, he'll let people through quicker than not. By the time you get to work, you will have used various modes of transport. and you put in a full shift, and then you come back and go through the same process again. And the daily routine for these workers is basically from bed to work and from work to bed. And sometimes there's really only 1 hour left in the day.
Really?
For them to spend with their family.
Yeah, that's horrible. And so they could spend several hours and just waiting in line to check on. Why do they have to get there so early?
There's no reason other than humiliation.
Uh-huh.
There really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
They could be let through a lot more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
They're just lined up and they wait for hours, and then they slowly filter through. It's a system that is not designed to stop them. It's a system that is designed to teach them their place.
Yeah.
Which is the place of subjugation. They're colonized people, and they're humiliated by doing this. That said, they still show up for work day after day, week after week, year after week, year after year, despite all of the obstacles and the indignities thrown in their path. It's an extraordinary record of resilience.
Yeah. So this is New England Authors. We're talking with Andrew Ross, and we're talking about Palestine, Israel, and the West Bank. So describe Jewish settlers for us. I've heard them described as pretty horrific people, and also just ordinary people who trying to live somewhere. What's your take on that?
I didn't spend a lot of time inside settlements. In fact, I only visited one or two, and so I don't have a lot of first-hand experience. I do know, however, that yes, there is quite a mix of a population mix inside settlements. Some of the settlers are, very religious and are driven by their zeal, and they believe that they're reclaiming or redeeming the land of Israel by ancient birthright. There are other Orthodox Jews who live there who tend not to be Zionists at all. They're very poor for the most part, and they tend not to work. And then there are other people, there are other Israeli Jews who have been priced out of the housing market in Israel itself, and the settlements happen to be the cheapest places to live.
They're subsidized by the government.
Subsidized, yes, they're heavily subsidized by the government. They're, in many ways, they're the last vestige of the Israeli welfare state, which inside Israel itself has long since eroded and semi-collapsed.
So what about the United States? They consider the settlements illegal officially, is that right?
Officially, yeah.
Officially, but turn a blind eye.
I think the current occupant of the White House would be quite happy to green light the annexation of the settlements, yeah. I don't think there would be really any obstacle to that.
Well, the green lighting the annexation would also mean that a lot of Palestinians would be able to vote, right? Or no?
Well, they don't live in the settlements. So I think when Netanyahu spoke recently about annexing the West Bank, I think practically speaking, what he has in mind is the Jewish settlements.
And what would happen to the other places? It would be like an apartheid state, or what?
Well, it already is an apartheid state, in my view, and many others. There is creeping expansion of the settlements. Every day there's new land that is taken. And so more than likely the logic of expansion would spread over much of the land, especially Area C, which is the largest part of the West Bank and is the most lightly populated by Palestinians. Israeli state has always been very careful to maintain a demographic majority. And so annexing the settlements would add several thousand residents to the Jewish population in Israel.
I see. Now, a lot of these, or some of the settlers are also American citizens, isn't that right?
Yes, some of them are, some of the most zealous, some of the most religiously zealous are American, yes.
Yeah. So I really like your idea of economic justice, and you published this book in order to create a reaction, right? In order to do something that to let people. Have you had any feedback on your book? This is a very emotional subject for many people. Have people come up and heckled you or spoke good for you or what since the publication?
Both, both of these things.
Mm-hmm.
The book is really, it's just out. It's just a couple of weeks since it was published, so the reception is still really just beginning. I wanted to, I mean, ultimately, I wanted the book to feed into this debate about the single state. And one of the arguments I make is that the Palestinians in many ways have earned full civil and political rights on the basis of their labor. This long record of sweat equity in building a country should translate into civil and political rights in that country. I call it political sweat equity. And so I'm hoping, and I haven't seen that argument advanced anywhere else, so I'm hoping, as an author, that I can inject that idea into the public debate and the political debate about the one-state solution, and see how far it goes.